starts the 5th of January 2004.
Tomorrow, our Reveal documentary series re-investigates the mystery of the Hindenburg airship explosion in 1937. That's Boxing Day at 2:35. Now we go further back to December 1914, when British and German soldiers celebrated an unusual Christmas truce.
The First World War begins in August 1914. 10 million men are about to die.
The First World War stands like a pair of iron gates across history. It's a great defining moment.
Running up out of your secure area and exposing yourself to enemy fire. This was the most terrifying thing that anybody could imagine.
Thoughts of a quick victory soon fade, and the Western Front becomes the deadliest place on Earth.
Men dug holes in the ground to get cover from machine gun fire, high explosive and shrapnel shell.
Then, in December 1914, there is an extraordinary victory. It is not a victory of generals or of weapons.
The First World War is like 4 years of hell, and there's just one day during these 4 years. There's a sparkle of hope and of humanity, and that's what the Christmas Truce is.
It's a victory, the like of which will not be seen again. World War I has gone down in history as the prime example of the brutality and senselessness of total war.
The reason the First World War is different from other wars is because for the first time, if you like, the Industrial Revolution, the mechanical age, hits warfare and they're combined. And so warfare, as it happened in 1914, was a complete shock to everyone.
Suddenly, the technology was available to make battle efficient, just like a factory, but for killing. The roots of the war lay in the previous 200 years of European history. By the end of the 19th century, an uneasy peace had been maintained between Britain, France and Germany through a complex structure of alliances with their European neighbors. But by 1910, Germany felt surrounded by its rivals and began making long-term plans for war. As H.G. Wells wrote, "Every intelligent person in the world knew that disaster was impending and knew no way to avoid it." On June 28, 1914, Serbian nationalist Gavrilo Princip killed Austro-Hungarian Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand. By the time he was buried, Europe was thrown into turmoil. By August 3rd, Germany had declared war against Russia and France. England was drawn in when Germany invaded Belgium. From the start, both sides thought they would achieve a swift victory.
The First World War began as not only the war that would end all wars, but also the First World War was seen as a big picnic, and it would all be over by Christmas.
The original plan that the Germans had, the strategic plan, which made a lot of sense on a piece of paper, was called the Schlieffen Plan. And the idea was that the Germans would come down through Belgium and take Paris, take France. What they didn't count on was the Belgians resisting and the French and the British mobilizing to stop them.
On August 7th, 1914, the first British expeditionary forces crossed the Channel and joined the French army in an attempt to halt the German advance. But by then, the Germans had conquered most of Belgium and the French border area. After 6 weeks of furious fighting, the Germans were stopped in their tracks.
So the Schlieffen Plan, when it was as simple as a drawing on a blackboard, was described as a revolving door motion. The Germans would come down, they would quickly sweep through France, and then they would be able to go and take on the Russians. But the problem was that when the British and the French came to stop them, the revolving door jammed, and it jammed permanently.
We're at a place called Plug Street Wood. Now, Plug Street is 7 miles to the south of Ypres in Belgium. And Ypres in Belgium is the place where the great Schlieffen plan comes unstuck. As the Germans swing round on this great wheel, they bang into the British infantry dug in here, and the Schlieffen plan stops. Both sides take cover, they go to ground in the trenches, and suddenly the first 2 months of mobile warfare has gone. The beginning of trench warfare is here. You could almost say that this is the pivotal spot on the British front.
All along the Belgian-French border, the Allies dug in, bringing men and materials up to the front to hold the line.
1914, it's very, very primitive. Both sides have just dug in, wherever they've just happened to come to rest, if you like, after the early opening battles. Trenches are just cut through muddy fields. In Flanders, certainly around Plug Street, the water table is very, very high. So 3.5 feet down you strike water. Tactically, the Germans always occupy the high ground, so we find ourselves left in a dip, men literally almost up to their necks in water. Now that's no condition to fight.
When people first arrived in the trenches, it was a shocking, arresting, frightening environment. It's a subterranean world. You're in these trenches that are cut in the ground, lined with planks on the floors. There's barbed wire up above. You can't see over the trench, and if you do go up and look over, there's a good chance you'll get your head shot off.
By the time the trenches were all dug, the trench system stretched 600 miles from the North Sea all the way down to Switzerland. Trench warfare had become a military science. The reality on the ground was very different from the theory.
The weather certainly becomes a bigger enemy than the enemy, because every day, you know, maybe there's an amount of danger from the enemy, but there's definitely going to be the enemy of cold and wet.
By autumn, the trenches were firmly established. The Germans could advance no further, but nor could the Allies drive them back. It was clear to everyone that no one would be home by Christmas.
For more huge reductions, visit the House of Fraser sale and get triple recognition points on sale purchases or 10% off electrical sale purchases. This Saturday only. Ask in store for details.
Don't miss Boxing Day at DFS. There's double the discount on a huge choice of special offers. So you save not once but twice on all these sofas and many, many more. As well as double sale savings, everything comes with not one, not two, but 3 years free credit, and everything's free for a year. Hot-foot it down for double the discount. That's Boxing Day at DFS. Doors open 9 a.m.
For more huge reductions, visit the House of Fraser sale and get triple recognition points on sale purchases or 10% off electrical sale purchases. This Saturday only. Ask in store for details.
Some murders are clear-cut. A trail of blood. A suspect. A motive.
She turned my lovely little girl into a vegetable.
Everything but the girl. A Mind to Kill, Wednesday at 9 on 5.
This was the first industrial war. It was the war where industrial technology was really applied to warfare for the first time. Just take, for example, the machine gun. Now, in the British Army at the time, in 1914, a well-trained rifleman could fire 15 to 20 aimed shots per minute. Now, the German machine gun could fire 600 rounds per minute, and one German machine gunner took the place of up to 30 riflemen.
Every day on the British sector alone, an average of 400 men were killed for 4 long years. You look around here at this graveyard, this is the memorial, this is Berkshire Memorial, to 11,500 men who just went missing just in this sector of the front. At Verdun, the French have 750,000 casualties, mass casualties in a way you can't even begin to think of. And so these are just the missing. These are the guys who fell in a shell hole, were blown to pieces by a shell, they were buried here in the front, and then their grave was blown up or lost. I mean, for example, look here, the King's Liverpool Regiment. Those are the missing just in this little sector of front. There are 3 other memorials like this in this area.
At the final count, both sides lost a total of 10 million men. On the Western Front, in the first few months alone, over 500,000 had lost their lives, and as winter set in, conditions got worse.
Many of the regiments along the Western Front recorded more deaths in November, December, January of 1914 to frostbite and to gangrene, things like that, to trench foot, than they did to enemy fire.
Trench foot is something that happens if your feet are permanently immersed in water and they're never dried off. Things would just get gangrenous and the toes would drop off and they'd go black and all sorts of things like that.
Adverse conditions and the stagnant campaign sapped the troops' will to fight, despite government's best efforts to demonize the enemy.
There was a definite explosion of propaganda during the First World War, like nothing that had ever been seen before, and this was something that happened on all sides of the war, in newspapers, in popular magazines, wartime propaganda, seeking to turn the Germans and the British against one another. The reason for that was that the men needed to be motivated, the nation needed to be motivated. You needed a kind of deep moral hatred of the enemy in order to sustain the kind of war that it was. You couldn't just think of him as your opponent in a sporting match. You needed to want to kill him.
And nowadays we talk about mass communication and spin doctors. These guys could teach us a thing or two. They really could. If you look at the phrase, the yellow press, the red-top tabloids of the day, they screamed about German atrocities and what the Germans did and the brutal Hun and so on. And so the whole nation's psyched up. And that's why so many Brits volunteered to fight in 1914. Don't forget, the British Army had no conscription at all until 1916, and the first conscripts don't hit until 1917. So the British Army fights the First World War and takes all the casualties with volunteers. And why do they volunteer? In their millions, and 1 million men volunteered by September. Why? Because they've seen these blazing headlines saying the brutal Hun. And so there's a huge propaganda war going on at the level of societies.
But real instances of civilian massacres by the German army did occur.
But this is a fact, and this happened. German atrocities at places like Dinant, where more than 600 people, men, women and children, were killed by the German forces. And at Louvain, which was claimed to be the Oxford of Belgium, with a library going back to 1426 with 230,000 volumes, ancient manuscripts and some of the rarest printed books ever produced. This was sacked in a period of 5 days from the 25th to the 30th of August, and many men, women and children were killed.
Meanwhile, young soldiers continued to fight each other and die on no man's land.
When I go to places where it was a battlefield, I can imagine young boys in the mud, bad weather. Sometimes I have the feeling that there are ghosts around here, that are still here somewhere.
Christmas was just a few days away.
They were promised that the war would be over by Christmas. This is really the crucial point in the beginning of the First World War. If it didn't end then, it would last for a very long time.
Both sides made tremendous efforts to bring Christmas cheer to their demoralized troops. All 355,000 British soldiers at the Western Front were sent a Christmas present from Princess Mary. Back in Britain, the public were encouraged to send the boys at the front all sorts of special cards, letters and presents. And it was the same for the Germans. Warm winter clothing, food treats, tobacco, cigars and letters, letters, letters. This made some soldiers even more homesick. Headquarters was very aware that during this period, the troops could let their guard down. And word was sent to the front warning of this danger.
The sole object of war becomes obscured, and officers and men sink into military lethargy, from which it is difficult to arouse them when a moment for great sacrifices again arises.
As night fell on Christmas Eve, the concerns of headquarters seemed prophetic. Something strange started to happen over at the German lines. Sounds of some sort drifted across the dark of no man's land. Sounds that no one had heard before in this war. It was the sound of singing. Could the Germans be planning a trick?
And that was how it started on Christmas night, with the lights on the German trench and songs being sung back and forth.
It was pretty much a German tradition. Christmas trees, St. Nicholas. It's something the Germans had always celebrated and something that we'd picked up in more recent times, so to them it meant a lot more. They'd been drinking, which was something that the British did discourage from the front line, so maybe it was just that the Germans were in more of a festive mood than we were.
Private Frank Sumter was one of the first to recognize what they were singing.
And then we heard the Germans singing Silent Night, Holy Night. Our boys said, let's join in. So we joined in with the song.
And in some places, there were actually instances where both sides of the Western Front, on both sides of no man's land, were singing the same hymn or carol, but in different languages at the same time.
One description of this night's events came from a well-known British artist, Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather.
Well, my father was actually there that night. He heard some sounds going on the evening before, singing from the other side, singing Christmas carols, and made him wonder what was going on. And he must have wondered what was going to happen the next day. After all, he knew it was going to be Christmas Day.
Bairnsfather was famous for his very, very humorous fragments from France, his cartoons, which he actually started to develop at Christmas 1914 in a cottage just behind us here, in the cellar of the cottage. And he drew on the walls at first, and very, very quickly they became very popular with the rank and file. Cartoons were published in a periodical called The Bystander, and really struck a chord with the people back home as well. Here were the British Expeditionary Force of 1914, actually in the trenches.
Bruce Bairnsfather wrote about waking up that Christmas morning.
It was the sort of day for peace to be declared. It would have made such a good finale. I should have liked the appearance of a small figure running across the mud and waving something. He gets closer. A telegraph boy with a wire. He hands it to me. With trembling fingers, I open it. War off, return home, George Rex. But no, it was a nice fine day. That was all.
He probably did not think seriously that something like that would really happen. It was just a happy fantasy. But then the reality that did take place was just as amazing or more so.
The British sentries didn't know what to make of what was happening across the narrow no man's land.
the Christmas tree was unknown in the rest of Europe. The Allied soldiers, they were amazed to see Christmas trees with lights on top, and they would wonder, what was it for? What is it about? The atmosphere must have been very special, and I think that added a lot to the fact that the truces did happen.
Private Leslie Walkington was there.
So then we began to pop our heads over the side and jump down quickly in case they shot, but they didn't shoot. And then we saw a German standing up waving his arms, and we didn't shoot.
You don't know what's going to happen. You have been told you have to come here, and those people you're facing are your enemies and you have to kill them. But really, all those young boys, they were not made to kill each other. They were afraid of each other.
So of course that boy said, well, if he can do it, we can do it. So Sergeant Major said, get down. So the boy, oh, no, shut up, Sergeant, it's Christmas time. So we all jumped up, and we all went forward.
When they met on Xmas Truce, first they were afraid of each other, and then they started to talk and shaking hands, and once they did that, it just seemed to be friends.
Well, I think certainly there was a sense of shared experience. Here they were in the trenches of the Western Front, and we have to remember that the autumn of 1914 was particularly wet. So the mud here was very, very thick. Trenches were absolutely waterlogged, sometimes up to 6 feet in places in certain parts of this sector. We're in a place called St Yvon, which is very near Plug Street Wood, and it's in the area where the Christmas truce took place. We're just behind the British front line here, and the Germans are just across the turnip field. Just behind the German line is a young German corporal by the name of Adolf Hitler, who whiled away the time in the trenches painting scenes like Messines Church. And he was here in the line just at Messines at the time of the Christmas truce indeed. May have been looking and may have heard the sounds of the Christmas truce on that day.
The British and the Germans gathered together.
Would you believe it? By mutual consent, our battalion and the Germans opposite had a little armistice. It was really funny to see the hated antagonists standing in groups, laughing and talking and shaking hands.
These men had no idea that this moment would resound through history. The museum in the Belgian town of Ypres is just 5 miles away from where British and German soldiers took part in the Christmas truce.
I always was interested in the people who were in those trenches, and that's how I got involved with this museum in the end. The statues behind me, my idea was that the figure had to break through their own mind frame. They were told that these were enemies, and all of a sudden they decided they were equals in human beings rather than being soldiers in a war.
This Christmas Day scene is exactly what the British High Command was worried about.
Friendly intercourse with the enemy and unofficial armistice, however tempting and occasionally amusing they may be, are absolutely prohibited. We impress on all subordinates the absolute necessity of encouraging the offensive spirit of the troops by every means in their power.
these men in no man's land were at as much risk from their own officers as they were from the enemy. Both sides knew that consorting with the enemy was only one step away from treason, a crime punishable by court-martial and execution.
Of course, there were instances along the Western Front of truces happening with the tacit approval of officers, whether they came out and said so or not. It was something that they allowed to happen. And I think that you can also make an argument that it may have been in the strategic interests of officers to allow their men this break, this respite, to allow them a couple of days to feel human again.
Either way, there were some bitter realities to deal with.
No man's land was littered with human remains. And this was something which, to some extent, the men in the trenches had been able to ignore. Unless you went over the top, you didn't necessarily have to look at these bodies of people you knew, people you'd lived side by side with in the trenches. So when people actually did tentatively make their way out on Christmas morning, what they found was a massive grave. And so first there was this grim task of going out and retrieving bodies and finding a place to bury them and laying them to rest.
British Corporal Robert Renton described the scene.
There were 2 dead Frenchmen between our lines, and the Germans helped us dig the grave. One of the officers held a service over one of the graves. It was a sight worth seeing and not easily forgotten. Both German and British paying respects to the French dead.
The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death,
auch wenn ich wandere im Tal des Todesschattens,
I will fear no evil.
Just a sale, it's a mega sale.
What is a sale?
Mega sale. Now on. And now here's Mike Swindle.
No sales, just low prices. That's Comet Sense.
The Homebase sale starts tomorrow with furniture down to half price, plus an extra 10% off for a limited time. This study bunk includes mattresses and chair at our lowest ever price.
Do you know how bright 500 watts is?
Just do as you're told, Roy.
Come on. And some great reports coming from our correspondents at each one of those grounds. And now it's time for today's football results. From today's big game, and what a delight!
In life, you can't always get what you want. But this Christmas, you can always get what you need at Spar.
I like giving presents that I want for myself.
I like it when people keep the receipt. I like standard life.
Actually, I don't think that's a word, dear.
No sales, just low prices. That's Comet Sense.
Beware, the woman spurned is a friend turned.
She's just a devil woman with evil on her mind. Beware the devil woman, she's gonna get you from behind.
I realised at the funeral what Black did for me.
Ruth Rendell's Vanity Dies Hard, 9 o'clock Tuesday on 5.
Xmas Truce, 1914. I'm glad I came. It's a place a lot of people ought to come to. This was where really it was ground zero. Yes, I don't suppose it's changed a great deal since then. I've got a book with a map in it of the area around here where the action took place that my father described way back in 1919. It shows 2 or 3 roads and the area of the British lines and the German lines, a fairly short distance apart, though I can't tell exactly how far.
Als ich noch Kind war, hat mein Vater meinen Bruder...
When I was still a child, my father sometimes used to tell me and my brother about the Xmas Truce held between British and German soldiers at Christmas 1914.
Es war eine sehr angenehme Unterhaltung.
It was a very pleasant conversation, and how wondrous it was that these men, who must stand against each other as enemies, could make peace for once at Christmas.
Miteinander gemacht haben.
Meeting each other at such close quarters created a problem that High Command was only too aware of.
Every other war proves undoubtedly that troops and trenches in close proximity to the enemy slide very easily, if permitted, into a live and let live theory of life.
By Christmas 1914, every soldier knew that the enemy was sharing the same misery as they were. So they had this common experience.
And so living in these dreadful conditions, and trench warfare in 1914 had come as a big shock. There were no pumps, it's very hard. Suddenly you realise the guy 50 yards away is probably just as miserable and unhappy and wet and cold and tired as you are. And so it came as a surprise, but it shouldn't have done, because it happens in every war. The common soldier and the low-level company officer identifies with his partner in misery on the other side.
Mr. Zemisch, how do you do? Very nice to meet you.
Ja. Mein Vater
ja.
hat Ihren Vater gesprochen.
Ja.
1914.
Sie?
Zu Weihnachten.
Ja.
Und heute treffen wir uns nach so vielen Jahren.
Ja.
Waffenstillstand, da stand also die Verbrüderung zwischen den englischen und den deutschen Soldaten.
Ich kann ein wenig Deutsch sprechen, aber nicht.
Ja. And I was only a little English.
Yeah. My father described seeing a German soldier cutting the hair of a British soldier.
Ja, die haben getauscht, Zigaretten gegen Zigarren.
Ja.
Und Schokolade gegen anderes Gepäck.
Lieutenant Bruce Bairnsfather's drawing of that day tells a story that he often told his daughter of how he snipped off a German's buttons as souvenirs. Another British soldier who was there, Leslie Walkington, wrote home on that day.
My dear father, mother and girls, just a line to let you know that I have had quite a merry Christmas. Talk about peace and goodwill, I never saw a friendlier sight. One of their officers took a photo of a group of intermingled troops. People from both sides met in no man's land, and we spent the day there, and we swapped cigarettes. It was really rather like a crowd at a football match, you know. And we exchanged odd little bits of food, just like a lot of boys from neighbouring schools. They were not nearly so strong looking as English fellows.
British soldier George Jameson also remembered that day.
There's no doubt about it. They were absolutely astounded at what is that they've got a football out there. They're kicking it around. They're having a marvellous time.
It must have been wonderful for those guys to go over that no man's land, which not yet pockmarked and not like the moon crater landscape that we all know from later in the war.
But while peace broke out in many places on Christmas Day, war as usual continued to rage on in other areas of the Western Front.
The British Army lost a lot of soldiers that day. There were a lot of men killed in action who
you know, whether it was shell fire or rifle fire. Some men had gone over to fraternise with the Germans and been taken prisoner and disappeared. Some NCOs had been over to meet the Germans, and on their way back a German sniper shot them. Some areas the divisional commander had said, you know, there will be no fraternisation, and good regular soldiers that they were had stuck to that and didn't participate, and if the Germans popped up, they would shoot at them.
Even as the trenches were emptied out by people playing football, some remembered there was a war on. The game offered an opportunity to wander over to the enemy's trenches and take a look at how they were laid out and where the gun emplacements were. This wasn't always successful, but it was worth a try.
The other football game, which was a proper football game between a Saxon regiment and Scottish blokes, witnessed by Semish, refereed by, I think, the German officer. And I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but the Germans won.
As German Lieutenant Johannes Niemann wrote,
"We Germans really rocked when the Scots revealed they wore no drawers under their kilts, and we hooted and whistled every time we caught an impudent glimpse of a posterior belonging to one of yesterday's enemies."
Christmas Day had been very different, even miraculous. Men on both sides went to sleep that night, wondering if they would wake up the next morning to renewed fighting or a continued effort to defy the war. In fact, on Boxing Day, the truce lingered on.
The biggest problem with a truce of this kind was that if the guys got used to the idea of not fighting, how on earth are you going to make them go back and start doing it again? It's a very real danger. If it spreads, there's a huge amount of men there who, once they've got a taste for the fact, well, actually, you know, we don't really need to fight after all.
A clear edict was sent out from on high by British command.
On Christmas Day, a friendly gathering has taken place of Germans and British on the neutral ground between the two lines. Many officers have taken part in it. I am calling for particulars as to names of officers in units which took part in this gathering with a view to disciplinary action.
But the threat of being punished was not enough to get most of the soldiers fighting again. They were forced to make a choice between orders from on high and a newfound feeling of fellowship with their enemy.
A lot of the soldiers by then were volunteers, not just professional soldiers. So they had a whole shared experience that they felt that they shared with the enemy. And they would have more in common with the enemy, private, than they would with their own command.
It was one thing when the British and Germans were facing each other on either side of no man's land and thinking, oh, the guy on the other side isn't that bad. He's dealing with the same rain I am. He's dealing with his trench collapsing just like I am. His rations can't be very good. He must have trouble finding a place to sleep at night. It's another thing altogether when you meet him in no man's land and you discover that he used to work as a waiter at a restaurant that perhaps you've eaten at, or as in one case, he was your barber back in London. It becomes much more difficult to demonize these men.
Private Frank Sumter of Southgate Road in Islington.
We shook hands in between, and I had the experience of talking to one German. This fellow said to me, you know Southgate Road in Islington? I said, yes. My uncle had a shoe repairing shop next door. He said, that's funny. He said, there's a barber shop on the other side where I used to work. So, you know, it's still ironic when you think about it that he must have saved my uncle at times, and yet my bullet might have found him, and his bullet might find me.
And so there was a wave of letters talking about the humanity of the Germans that went back to London and presumably back to Germany.
These letters all described things that sounded very strange to the people back at home. This is not what they'd been taught to think about the enemy. As the Christmas truce was reported in the press, the story seized the public's imagination. Meanwhile, the officers at the front line were trying to restore discipline. It didn't always work, as British Private Archibald Stanley remembers.
One of these knobs of people that just got his commission, you know. Katie Carroll, his name was.
Stand to!
And he come up and he said, this has got to cease.
Shake aim!
The officer wanted to fire on unarmed men.
All right, he said, give him a volley. We didn't take any notice. Didn't fire at them. We never fired at the Germans. Although we were at war, I thought they were a bit wicked, you know, taking advantage like that.
How amazingly difficult it must have been for these people to pick up shooting again, and with any kind of vigor, try and kill people in the opposite trench that they just celebrated Christmas with 2 days before.
Tremendous pressure was exerted to get the war back on track. Orders and threats from the high command on both sides rained down on the men at the front lines. The commanders needed to get their men back into the fight at all costs.
The godfather of my wife was sent out in one of the listening posts. The whole front is silent and the Germans opposite start singing. When all of a sudden Urbain Crevé, my wife's godfather, remembers the very strict order given to him by his officer, saying you have to report everything. So he picks up the field telephone and dutifully reports back that the Germans are singing songs opposite. And then he says, I still hold the horn of the telephone in my hands when the shelling starts. Within minutes, the complete place is shot to pieces. No doubt many Germans have died there. And he hears from the screaming, a lot of have been wounded. And all he hears is the wounded.
Private Archibald Stanley remembered how his officer put an end to their armistice.
Well, a few of them knocking around, this fella come up the next day. He said, you still got the armistice?
The officer knew exactly what he was doing.
Picked up his rifle, he shot one of the Germans dead. That was the end. That finished it. That war started again. Never finished in 1918, did it?
The mechanics of war are thus that it's very hard as an individual, as a group of individuals, to stop it.
The Christmas truce was brutally suppressed, and far worse was about to come.
The Homebase kitchen sale starts tomorrow. All kitchen units and worktops are half price when you spend over £200. Plus, there's an extra 10% off for a limited time only. You can choose from our biggest ever range, and with the Homebase card, there's nothing to pay for a whole year. We'll help you plan your kitchen for free. Plus, there's free delivery when you spend over £350.
You know, some of the best chefs in the world are men.
And some of the worst.
Hurry on down to Homebase. Sale starts tomorrow.
What will you come away with? The John Lewis clearance starts Saturday, open all weekend.
How long was it that you went without any daylight? They ever let you out for any exercise?
The trial that brought down Alcatraz.
I want you to get up there and change my plea to guilty. I thought you wanted to fight.
Murder in the First. New Year's Day at 9 on 5.
The year that followed did not provide the decisive breakthrough that the warring nations expected. The trench lines stayed virtually where they had started. 1915 was a year of terrible losses. Millions died. Poison gas was used for the first time in war. By the following Christmas, men on every side of the front were desperate and deeply demoralized. High command on both sides was well aware that conditions were ripe again for the men to want to lay down their arms at Christmas. Britain's new commander-in-chief, Sir Douglas Haig, gave new orders.
The Brigadier wishes to give you the strictest orders that any man attempting to communicate either by signal or by word of mouth or by any other means with the enemy is to be seriously punished.
The German troops were issued with an even clearer order.
Any attempt at fraternization with the enemy, such as occurred last year at Christmas, will be considered as high treason. General Headquarters have issued instructions that fire will be opened on every man who leaves the trench and moves in the direction of the enemy without orders.
Ultimately, you know, Christmas Day is just like any other day, and in subsequent years of the war, the fighting just carried on. There was, you know, a few places in 1915 where both sides did stop and half-heartedly try and recreate it, but there was never any specific attempt to do that.
It was the end of an era.
The beginning of the war, it looked somewhat like wars that had preceded it. Officers came in on horseback. Men were on foot. But bear in mind, there hadn't been a major war in Europe for the better part of a century when Europe went to war in 1914. So you have a war that, with a few new weapons in 1914, looked like old wars. They had machine guns and shells and things like that, but the real technological advances of the war didn't come until later. The tank, chemical weapons, strafing from airplanes. By the end of the war, it was unrecognizable. It was modern war as we, to some extent, as we know it today.
Today, all around the Belgian town of Ypres, it's easy to see the scars of the battles of World War I.
Going around the countryside, you'd find shrapnel bullets, pieces of rusty metal that belong to the war. You go out on your bike and you try and discover it yourself. And it starts always with the cemeteries, because there are so many around. So you try to understand them. And so then you realize that it was probably the last war that didn't pay any attention whatsoever to the loss of human life.
Rows and rows of graves are the last resting place of hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed on the Western Front. And it's still not over. Even today, trenches are being excavated and soldiers are being found in their makeshift graves.
I mean, this is a remarkable excavation, and it's really brought to life what it must have been in the trenches. For example, so this little find here, this is a pile, we can tell because of the rim. These are British-fired bullets that have been obviously come out of the machine gun belt and left here, and they've been lying here for 60 years in the mud of Ypres. Here we've got an underground bunker, steps leading down, and probably 20, 30 feet below ground, a company headquarters. Men lived below ground here. And here in Ypres, hundreds of thousands of men lived for 4 years in holes in the ground like this. It's a subterranean existence, men living like moles. Incredible.
I see always the same reaction. They look very sad, because of course the people who take to places like that are people who think back at relatives and how much they had to suffer. And why was it not possible to keep that peace after Christmas?
What's interesting about the Christmas truce is you seem to be right there on a fault line. And that's the sense you get when you read the writings of these men who, looking back in Christmas 1915, Christmas 1916, think, how could that have happened? What did we have then that we don't have now?
In Ypres, World War I is remembered every single night of every year.
By Mrs. Barbara Littlejohn, daughter of Bruce Bairnsfather, Captain Bairnsfather took part in the famous truce at Brook Street in December 1914. She will be accompanied by Rudolf Xmas, the son of Kurt Xmas, whose father also participated at this truce at Lux Street.
It must be amazing for the descendants of Germans and British who squared off across no man's land to come back now at the beginning of the 21st century, stand on that same scarred battlefield and think about that distance that their ancestors overcame. In some ways, they're standing there across the wasteland of the 20th century, across everything that the First World War wrought. Because as we know, the Western Front was just the beginning of it. And now we can look back and things are mended and we can come together and shake hands again. But no man's land is still there.